Okay, so the Alamo happens. All the defenders are killed either that day or the next, March 6th or the next. We think Davy Crockett was killed the next day. There's actually a lot of controversy about that, but I think the historical record's pretty clear. Um, and then Santa Anna makes a big mistake. So I'm on the map here, and so I'm circling Santa Anna. It says February 24th, but really it's March 6th, 1836. The map's it's mistaken here. February 24th is when Santa Anna got to San Antonio. So what happens is that Santa Anna should have gone after Houston. He should have gone directly east as soon as he defeated the men at the Alamo, as soon as he captured the Alamo. Houston, it's the militia, the Texas Army militia is not very well organized. It's could have been taken pretty easily, but what Santa Anna does is he rests in San Antonio, partially, actually, to a large extent, it's his fault because he'd had so many men killed at the Alamo because he ordered this charge, this attack, which was really unnecessary. He should have waited for his artillery to show up, and then he could have bombed it into submission and then killed everyone. But instead, he attacks. Hundreds of his best fighters are killed in the Alamo. And so the Mexican army suffers a wound, not only in terms of the loss of some of its best soldiers, but also in the sense that Mexican soldiers are losing faith in Santa Anna because he didn't need to attack when he did, and they knew it. So he stays in San Antonio for a couple of weeks, and what that does is that gives Sam Houston, who is east of San Antonio, that gives Sam Houston and the portion of the Texas Army that he is with, that gives them a breather, that gives them a time to collect some of the supplies that are coming in from Louisiana. He is able to march and drill his men at Jared Grossey's plantation, which you might remember Jerry Grossey was the largest slave owner in Texas at this time. And so Santa Anna, by waiting in San Antonio, probably because he had to kind of regroup after the horrors of the Battle of the Alamo. He gives Sam Houston time to organize. Now, at this point, let's head to Goliad. You might remember that Goliad, there were about 350 or so Texian soldiers in Goliad under the inept command of James Fannin. I've talked about he's a slave trader. He brought in slaves from Havana. Travis had tried to get Fannin to bring his troops up to San Antonio, but Fannin hesitated and they never made it to San Antonio. They left Goliad and then they went back. Fannin was super indecisive. And the problem for Fannin is he is facing Santa Anna's best general, and that's General Urrea. And you can see Urea's name spelled in the keyword box that I put below the podcast. Urea comes up from Matamoros. So Santa Anna comes up into Texas in two columns. He comes up through central Mexico, through Eagle Pass, maybe where San Juan Bautista area, and he attacks San Antonio from the southwest. Well, the other column, the second column under General Urea, it cuts over to Matamoros and it comes up near the Texas coast. And long story short, pretty easily it captures, General Urea captures Fannin's men at Goliad. There is some fighting at Goliad, but Urea is an excellent general. He knows what he's doing. He completely outmaneuvers Fannin, and then he accepts the surrender of Fannin's men. And then Urea takes off. He heads north to find Santa Anna to attack Houston's men. Okay, and then what happens after that is an atrocity. Santa Anna gets word that the survivors of Goliad have not been killed, which he wanted them killed. He orders them executed. The officer in charge of Goliad decides to obey Santa Anna's order, General Portillo. And on Palm Sunday, which is just 3 weeks after the Alamo, 1836, the Texans that have been captured at Goliad, they're told that they're going to march out of Goliad, that they're going to march to the Gulf of Mexico. They're going to be put on boats and they're going to be freed. They're going to sail to New Orleans and out of Texas. So they're very, very happy. So on Palm Sunday, they march out of Goliad. There's 3 roads that go out of Goliad. The men are split up into 3 columns of about 100 apiece. And as they start marching, Mexican soldiers appear on either side of each column and start firing. And when all was said and done, almost all of these men were executed. Very, very few escaped just by sheer luck. It was such a carnage. Some of the men, the Texans, pretended to be dead, and they managed to escape into the brush. Fannin actually was the last person executed on that Palm Sunday. So this is the Goliad massacre. And it is an atrocity. It's a war crime. You can argue that the Alamo was a battle, but you can't argue that about Goliad. It was the murder of innocent civilians. So what happens is that the Goliad garrison is completely wiped out. And that at that point, Santa Anna begins his eastward movement towards Sam Houston and Sam Houston's militia. Now, at that point, Houston's militia, it starts marching east and north. And at the same time, you have what's called the runaway scrape, where civilians in Texas absolutely panic. And they make a break for Louisiana. Why Louisiana? Well, think about it. That's U.S. territory. Santa Anna's not going to follow them into U.S. territory. The other thing is there's a fort, a U.S. fort, right on the border. And so if they can get to U.S. territory, they're going to be safe from Santa Anna, because they've seen what's happened at Alamo. They hear what's happened at Goliad, and they're terrified of Santa Anna. So they make this break towards Louisiana. One of the big things to realize about this so-called runaway scrape is that the Texans that have slaves are taking their slaves with them. Someone reported once at one of the crossings, the river crossings, that there were actually more slaves than whites. Slave owners are panicked because, for all that Santa Anna is evil, and certainly he did evil things, Santa Anna had decided that he was going to free the slaves of Texans that he captured. So that throws a little bit of a wrinkle into our understanding of Santa Anna. He had decided that any slaves that he captured, slaves of the Anglos that were revolting against him, would be given their freedom. So that kind of puts a different angle on the Texas Revolution, doesn't it? You can almost see Santa Anna as an emancipationist. And remember, there's 5,000 slaves in Texas at this time. So yeah, just a little bit of a different way of looking at Santa Anna. Now, Houston is marching north and east at this time, and there's a lot of suspicion both then and now that Houston was trying to draw the U.S. into the Texas Revolution. As I said before, there was a fort in Louisiana right on the border, Fort Jessup, under the command of a U.S. officer named Gaines. There was a lot of suspicion that Houston was marching towards Louisiana to draw Gaines into Texas, and that Gaines would join with Sam Houston and fight Santa Anna. There's no smoking gun evidence, but there's quite a bit of speculation. But what happens to Houston's army is that they revolt against Houston. They get tired of retreating. Remember, it's a pretty undisciplined army, and they refuse to retreat anymore. So at San Jacinto, which is just outside of Houston, on April 19th, you have an element of Santa Anna's army meets the elements of the Texas Army under Sam Houston. And they face off in the morning, and then Santa Anna, who is a pretty bad general, he lets his men rest. And the Texas Army on April 20th, 1836, they attack Santa Anna's army, catches them completely off guard. They're completely surprised. And what they start doing is they start murder. They defeat Santa Anna's army, and then they start murdering prisoners of their own. The biggest massacre of prisoners in the Texas Revolution wasn't Alamo. It wasn't the Goliad. It was the massacre of Santa Anna's soldiers at San Jacinto, because the battle was over within about 15 or 20 minutes, and then Texans um, who were enraged about Goliad and Alamo, they just started murdering Mexican soldiers. And up to 600 Mexican soldiers were killed in this massacre. Only a handful of Texans, something along six or seven, were along the lines of six or seven, were killed during this episode. By the way, Juan Seguin fought in San Jacinto. His men had to wear special hats with feathers in them because Sam Houston knew if they didn't, that they'd be massacred too, because a lot of the army couldn't tell them from Mexican soldiers. So when all was said and done, miraculously, Texas, because of Santa Anna's poor generalship, um, was defeated, and Texas becomes an independent nation.